Before we get into today's episode, I want to share something that's helped transform my daily routine. I've started using Bob, the refillable bottle-free body wash designed specifically for men. If you're still using bottled shower gel, you're literally washing money down the drain. Let's face it, you always use more than you need and half of it just slips through your hands before it touches your skin. Bob combines a reusable applicator with exfoliating bristles and the world's first refillable body wash bars, formulated to match a man's skin pH of 5.5. All this means you get a deep clean with zero wastage. It's better for your skin, better for your wallet, and better for the planet. Plus, it's travel proof. Just pop on the lid and your Bob is ready to go wherever you are. For an exclusive 15% offer on your first order, head over to welcometobob.com and use the code meaningofmen15 at checkout. Welcome back to The Meaning of Men. I'm your host, Simeon Atkins, and today I'm joined once again by Dr. Krista Fisher from Movember. In this episode, we unpack Movember's latest research into how digital spaces are shaping the health, relationships, and identity of young men. The report, Young Men's Health in a Digital Age, explores the influence of online content creators, particularly those focused on masculinity. We talk about their rise into the mainstream, the reason boys are drawn to them, and the complex contradictions of how these influencers can offer both short-term hope and long-term harm. This hugely important conversation gets to the heart of what it means to grow up as a young man today, and how we can better support them in a world that's becoming more divided, more digital, and more confusing than ever. Let's get into it. Dr. Krista Fisher, welcome back to the show. For anyone that missed our first episode together, can you remind everyone who you are and the work that you're doing with Movember?
Sure. Yeah, great to be back. My name's Dr. Krista Fisher. I'm a researcher at the Movember Institute of Men's Health. And our last episode where I was here, I spoke a lot about my PhD research, which had focused on young men's anxiety. And I'm really excited today to be talking about some new research that I've been leading at Movember, which goes beyond just looking at young men's mental health to start to think about the broader online ecosystems that they're also inhabiting. And my interest in this work in particular is really starting to look at how those online lives of young men are shaping their health outcomes offline as well.
Young Men's Health in a Digital Age is the name of the new report that's coming out from Movember. And it's coming at a time where the conversation around boys and young men seems to be really hitting the mainstream. Obviously, the show Adolescence, which really helped bring it to the fore, but also other reports like Lost Boys that came out from the Centre of Social Justice, which is another very, very comprehensive report around the subject as well. I'd be interested to know what inspired Movember to publish this specific report around young men's health in the digital age. And maybe if you could give us a 30,000-foot view of the research methodology that you took for this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It is so timely. We've been working, myself and a broader research team at Movember have been working on this research for about a year, but the social climate changes so often. Like even just in the last year that we've been working on this research, there have been policy changes. There have been more and more conversations about regulating and banning social media. There have been increasing dialogues around what's been called the manosphere. And then, just in the last month, we've seen this new TV show released by Netflix called Adolescence. And I think that's had well over 114 million views now. So it is absolutely front and center for everyone. And, a lot of these, from my perspective as a men's mental health researcher, a lot of the issues that young men are facing today in their offline lives aren't new. And we know that there are unique challenges that young men face. We have done quite a lot of work in the field of psychology to unpack and understand that. But what is really new today about young men growing up in this contemporary age is that they're navigating all of these challenges in this digital world. So the online worlds that they're straddling alongside their offline worlds are absolutely changing the way that they're growing up, the way that they're interacting with other people, and their health as well. So that was really the genesis of Movember's interest and my interest in this space. We have obviously, as a charity and myself as a researcher, done a lot to focus on young men's mental health and improve young men's mental health. But this felt like a really fitting an important area for myself and for Movember to show up. If we're going to advocate for young men, if we're going to understand and help address some of their challenges that they're facing with their mental health, we knew that this was a really important area for us to understand. And whilst there have been increasing conversations and more research unpacking the impact of social media for young men and also the community more broadly, before this report that's come out, there hadn't really been much work actually speaking to young men, understanding from young men's perspectives what kind of content they're engaging with online, what role this content has in their lives, what they like, what they don't like about it. So that was a real opportunity for us, knowing how well we engage young men, our ability to speak to young men. We knew that we would be uniquely placed to do this work and to undertake this research. So the bird's eye view of the methodology, in a very quick snapshot, we surveyed just over 3,000 young men in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, and we asked them a range of questions about the influencers that they're regularly engaging with online. And by influencers, I mean the content creators who are creating content that they're watching and consuming online. And we'd done really extensive preliminary research through interviews, through focus groups with young guys to ask them and to understand the types of content and influences that they were watching online, which then allowed us to kind of build out a list for young men to select from, to say, yes, I engage with these influencers regularly, or I don't. And from that, we were able to create two groups: young men who are regularly watching masculinity influencers. So these are influencers with really large followings, over 10 million people in their audience. And these masculinity influencers predominantly create content about men, about masculinity, and whereas we had some other influencers who we knew were prominent on social media, but did not create content specifically about masculinity or men. And so that then allowed us to have two groups of young men in this 3,000 sample and look at a whole range of differences between these groups. We asked them questions about their personal outlooks. We asked them questions about their health, their levels of risk-taking behaviours, and we asked them questions about what they thought men's roles were in society, in workplaces, in families, and we asked a whole lot of questions about their dating lives and their relationships with other people.
I think why research like this is just so important is because we've seen the impact that adolescence has had. And I think what it's been great for is bringing this conversation to the mainstream. But I think what it's really important for people to remember that it is just a TV show. It's not a documentary. And even the co-writers will be the first to say it's not based on concrete research like this. And so when the UK Prime Minister, for example, is saying things like we should be rolling it out to all of the schools in the UK, every child should see adolescence, even to the point where it's starting to dictate government policy, I think we just need to put on the brakes and actually take a step back and look at research like this and research like Lost Boys, and actually, as you said, hearing what these boys are actually saying, listening to what they're actually saying, and kind of starting to dictate from there. And I think why this kind of research is so important. You were saying that you were looking at the type of content, but I think what you also do in the research is you look at why these young boys are getting drawn to these influences. And I think that's such an important piece of the puzzle. I think we can spend so much of our time trying to silence a lot of these influencers and trying to distance ourselves from them. My opinion is that we really need to be looking at what is sending young boys to these influencers, what are the driving factors, and starting to address those issues as you are in the report, as opposed to just focusing on, well, the answer is just to get rid of the influencers, because as we kind of highlight, as you highlight in the research, they are now part of the mainstream conversation. And so just understanding those driving factors, I think, is really important.
I totally agree. And you put it so perfectly, where we use adolescence as an example for something that is now a kind of cultural moment that has brought this issue that a lot of subject matter experts and researchers and politicians have been talking about behind the scenes now into more mainstream spaces. And that's so powerful because, like, adolescence, it was so beautifully done. It, I think, really inspired empathy in audiences and opened up a greater understanding and exploration of an issue that a lot of people did not understand. But what happens when we use one story or one case study to explain a population-wide issue now is that when we're trying to engage and speak to the very people who are affected by this phenomenon, which is young men, they may watch adolescents and think, that doesn't relate to me at all. That doesn't impact me at all. This isn't about me. So I think we really need to be leaning on the empirical based insights that research is able to give us. And it's a bit of both, like the storytelling and the depth that we can get from platforming one person's experiences is really powerful, because it can inspire and open up conversations, and it can help people understand things that they may not have otherwise. But it also risks, I think, disconnecting some people who don't see their experiences reflected in these stories. And we have to be really careful sometimes when we're using these extreme examples, these real life cases that we've seen play out of offline violence, which has been motivated from online misinformation or online content. We have to be really careful when we use these extreme examples not to perpetuate alarmist narrative as well, because that drums up increasing concern, increasing worry. And whilst a number of, I think that is understandable and necessary when we talk about those extreme instances. But what that misses is bringing nuance into the ways that it's showing up and shaping society, really, and a whole generation of young men.
I think the other thing that was great about this report, and speaking with the likes of Dr. Niobe Way, who's author of Rebels with a Cause, is that I think sometimes we get this misconception that boys and young men aren't willing to open up and aren't willing to talk and are somehow very emotionally disconnected. But you've obviously been able to get such a rich insight into these boys' lives, which is obviously through the fact that they've been willing and wanting to open up and talk and share their experiences. And we just maybe need to open up our ears a little bit and just listen to them rather than dictating what we feel they should be saying or what we think that they need.
Couldn't agree more. The question I always get asked is, how do we engage young men? they're not talking to us. How do we understand if we're not able to reach them or to retain them in these kinds of conversations? And I always just think they absolutely are talking. The very issue that we're talking about, or the very phenomenon that we're talking about, social media or the manosphere, which can be defined as these closed online forums and online communities, are the perfect example of that. They are absolutely showing up in these spaces. They are having conversations about masculinity, about self-optimization, about mental health, about health. But when we're not in those communities, when we're not in those spaces or showing up where young men are, it's easy to sit back and think, oh, well, they're not interested. They're not willing to engage with us. And that just blatantly is not true.
I want to go to the end before we go to the start. And I want to ask you this question. When you'd finished doing the research and you'd finished writing the report and you put that metaphorical pen down and everything had finished, what was your overriding feeling of the state of young men's health once you'd finished that research?
That is such a good question. It's easy to reflect or think about it as a process or a project that had an endpoint, and I don't think it does. I have now still multiple projects that are ongoing that are looking at some of the findings that we've got from this research, that are unpacking more and more gaps that we have identified from this work we still don't understand. But I think that there were a lot of learnings that I took from doing this specific project, asking the 3,000 young men about the influences that they're following, trying to understand how that's shaping their health and their lives. I'm very uniquely placed, I would say. And there are a number of other female researchers doing work in this space. But when I step away sometimes from work or from my dummy TikTok account that I have posing as a 18-year-old young man to try to understand the types of things that they're seeing online. When I step away and I log back into my own personal TikTok account and I have conversations with my friends about things in our own online ecosystems that we're interested in or that may target a 30-year-old female specifically, I feel like what has become more and more clear actually to me is how polarized some of these online worlds are, and how when I think about the types of content and the types of topics that an 18-year-old young man might be engaging with and the conversations that they're having online with their peers about some of these issues, when I think about how differently that is to the type of content and the things that I consume and that I know my immediate social circle consumes, I do become increasingly worried about this split and this disconnection that I think is absolutely playing out in our society. And I just feel now more than ever that I can't show up and hope to understand offline health challenges without also looking at and understanding online worlds. I just think that they are so interconnected and they're becoming increasingly so.
As we're going through this, I want to give people as much context as possible from the report. There's so much that we can discuss and dissect, and we've chosen a few specific areas. I want to start with this stat. 63% of young men in Australia, the UK, and the US are regularly engaging with content from at least one men or masculinity influencer. And they will obviously come from a spectrum in terms of how extreme they are, but I think that just highlights your point around how much they're consuming. What did the research say was driving them to seek out these influencers? And building on that, what are some of the common misconceptions around the profile of boys that are engaging with this content and why they're engaging with it?
So you're right, 63% of young men in our 3,000 plus samples said that they were watching one or more masculinity influencer. So that is over the majority. That means that if a young guy logs onto social media, he is more likely to be engaging with masculinity influencers than not. So that speaks to absolutely, like you said, Simeon, the mainstream nature of these influencers and this content now. And that was pretty even across our three markets. So young men in the US, young men in the UK, and young men in Australia were all pretty even in terms of the rates at which they were engaging with masculinity influences. And the reasons why they said that they liked the masculinity influencers content was because they found them entertaining, they were motivating, and they were inspiring. So they are three really important things for us outside of men's online worlds to remember and to consider, that from young men's perspectives, they saw their content as having a positive, at least initially, impact for them. And they also kind of spoke to us about the ways that the influencers' advice was starting to shape their offline behaviors too. So almost 40% of young men who were watching these masculinity influencers said that they had also acted upon influencers' advice. So this wasn't just content that they were engaging with in kind of a trivial type way, that these influencers were having very substantial impacts on their offline worlds as well. And from young men's perspectives, they said to us in the survey that they had more positive benefits from acting upon influencers' advice than negative. So they said to us that they felt happier and that they had a greater sense of purpose from acting on influencers' advice than the negative outcomes. So there were less young men saying that they had felt anxious or unhappy from acting upon influencers' advice. So again, that's saying that at least initially, and at least in more of a short-term sense, young men were feeling like these influencers were having a positive impact on their lives in one way or another. And what was really interesting was that when we looked at the demographic backgrounds of young men who were engaging with masculinity influences relative or compared to those who weren't, we could see some interesting differences. And that actually challenged some of my assumptions that I had around the backgrounds of young men who would be more likely to gravitate to these masculinity influences. So the young guys who were watching these masculinity influences were more likely to be white, to be older, to be employed full time, and to be in a committed relationship. So what that says is that it's not just about young men coming from disenfranchised or disadvantaged positions in our society, but it's actually also young men who want to maintain potentially those positions of power or privilege in our societies. And it's certainly not as clear cut or as simplistic as that. But again, it speaks to the mainstream nature of these masculinity influences, that it isn't just young men who may be isolated or maybe single and turning to these influencers and key personalities in this space to help them obtain those things. That again, for the mainstream young guy, they're logging on and they are seeing these influencers and they're liking their content.
You used three words there at the start: entertaining, motivating, and inspiring. And if you just took those three words in isolation, you'd think, well, this is great content. We should be directing our boys and young men to this. This sounds great. And what was really interesting, what I learned from it, I think, is that when you think about influencers, you automatically think of the Andrew Tates of these world. Like, their message is very obvious and clear in terms of what they're saying. But what you were unpacking in the report was that a lot of these influencers, actually, the vast majority of their message might well be positive. So it could be a fitness influencer that's encouraging a young man to go out and exercise and giving him tips and guidance of how to do that. But then subtly threaded within that will be some very extreme views and very extreme messages. And obviously then the more and more that those boys and young men are consuming that, the more they'll become receptive to that. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to be aware of, is that it won't always be very, very obvious in terms of who these people are. You use the term masculinity a lot, and my personal opinion is that obviously masculinity is one part of what it means to be a man, but it seems to be one of the most prominent building blocks in that, I guess. And I think that one of the issues that I see, and I've put this out on my social media and got a lot of responses from it, is this term toxic masculinity. My view is that it's such a dangerous term to use, because what it's doing is it's stopping us from having healthy conversations around masculinity. And my opinion around toxic masculinity is it doesn't exist. There are toxic people, but fundamentally, if you think about what encompasses toxic masculinity, whether it's violence or bullying or misogyny, they aren't masculinity traits. And so I think what's really important is to start to separate these two things. Yes, we do have toxic people, men and women, and we need to address that. But I think it's so important to be able to not have this gag reflex every time we think about the term masculinity, because it is fundamentally very, very important for a lot of boys and men. And we need to be able to recognize and celebrate all of the strengths of it, because what I see is that a lot of boys and young men are getting drawn to these influencers because they're talking about how good their masculinity is and the importance of masculinity. And yes, they are taking it to a very extreme place. But I think that if we could start to decouple toxic and masculinity and start to have better conversations around it, I think that might be able to help us have it in a safer space, as opposed to driving them to these extreme views.
You're absolutely right. And I think the problem that we fall into in so many aspects of society at the moment is that we want to bucket things. We want to label things as good or bad. And it comes back to the point that you made earlier around our labeling of masculinity influences as good or bad. And it just is not the case. It's just not that simple. There is, in the context of influences, a spectrum of influences in this space, but also a spectrum of content that they create. They could have one video that might be making a joke about something that happened to them when they went and bought food at the supermarket that day. Then in the same day, upload a video that talks about how men should be able to control their wives' finances. So we cannot bucket things as much as we would like to. It's just not that simple or that easy. And this plays out as well with masculinity. And we know it's why these influences have such resonance with young men, is because when you are a young man navigating the uncertainties of the world that they are, when there are a number of things that they're grappling with. You've got the onset typically of mental health issues is around that early adolescence, early adulthood time. You have a number of key life transitions and life milestones where you're leaving school, or you might be beginning or ending a relationship. You might be entering the workforce for the first time. And as a young man, you're starting to grapple with these very complex existential questions about what being a man looks like. What does being a good man look like? What do I have to do to be able to attain the very things in life that I want? What are my intrinsic values versus what am I being told I should value or should live up to? And understandably, having a 30-second TikTok video give you 5 steps to be able to be the best man and to have the hottest girlfriend and to be the successful CEO that you want to be, of course that's going to resonate. Of course that's going to motivate and inspire them, because we're not having those conversations anywhere else. So these influencers have a very ripe, very engaged, and in some instances, very desperate audience of young men. And part of that is the way that we have had conversations about masculinity to date, and that we have failed to have idolized male role models, idolized notions of masculinity that young men see as aspirational and that engage them in the way that these online influencers do.
Hi everyone, I want to take a moment to shout out Ep6 Everest, an incredible organisation and partner of the show who are pushing the limits of human resilience. Imagine this, climbing the equivalent of Mount Everest, but right here in the UK, by summiting the Helvellyn mountain 9 times in just 48 hours. But Apex isn't just about the challenge, it's the chance to be part of a year-round, vibrant community dedicated to unlocking your true potential. Whether you're looking to push your own limits or you're part of a team wanting to build an unshakable bond, this experience will stick with you for life. So if you're ready to conquer your Everest and be part of something special, check out apexeverest.com to find out more. The report found that young men who regularly engage with influencers reported more optimism about their personal circumstances and the social circumstances for men in the future, but then also reported worse mental health outcomes, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron to me. Why do you think that is? Like, can you unpack that for us?
We've called that the contradiction in men's emotions and also men's health. So it's certainly something that we unpack and explore in the report. And that was surprising initially when I saw that, and I was sitting there thinking about some of the insights that we got back from the survey. But the more and more we talked about it as a research team, the more it absolutely made sense and potentially speaks to the differences between the short-term emotional hit that these influences may elicit in young men and the deeper, kind of longer-term offline realities of the health challenges that so many of them are navigating and grappling with. So when this masculinity content and when these influences can reduce very complex issues into, as I touched on before, short, digestible, solution or practical orientated steps, even if you haven't actually reached that goal or milestone or benchmark that you want to, it inspires this future orientated momentum that makes you feel better about yourself, because even if you haven't got there yet, you know the steps that you need to take to get there. But what that does is it sets up a broader question around when the bar is set so high, when your expectations that you might have of yourself or that you feel like others have of you is so high, what happens then when young men fall short? And we know that it's not necessarily compassion or their connections that they lean into. It's self-blame and feelings of failure. So yes, those tensions were absolutely there in the data that we saw. We were seeing young men who watched masculinity influencers saying to us that they felt more optimistic about their personal and social circumstances, but a number of them were facing mental health challenges. So they were more likely to be reporting higher levels of worthlessness, sadness, and restlessness. And what we weren't able to distill from the research, but absolutely we'll be looking at in future studies, is do those mental health challenges lead or encourage young men to actually seek out these masculinity influences? Or is it what I touched on before, that the sense of falling short or their inability to attain all the things that they're told they should or that they may internally want to, when that doesn't happen, is it then the blame, the sense of failure, the feelings of sadness kind of perpetuate those other distresses that they may be experiencing as well.
Yeah, interesting. What you were saying there was making me think it's the promise of what could be, I suppose, these influencers. So it's not even, as you were saying there, necessarily reaching that goal. It's even just having the vision or the thought that there is a chance of a better life, and you know, you're using words like worthlessness there and restlessness. Just having some kind of vision that things could be different in the future is obviously enough to start to make them feel better about themselves.
Mm.
I want to start making this feel even more real for people that are listening. And in the report, you talk about a young man called Will and his story. Can you give us a bit of background into who Will is and what his story is, and what you shared in the report around him?
Would love to. I don't want to do a disservice to Will's story. He is an incredible young man in his own right. So I would encourage any listeners who want to read or hear about his story to go to the report that we will include in the show notes, I'm assuming, or be able to direct other people to that. But Will does a really beautiful job of reflecting on his own personal journey, of finding, from his perspective, connection, guidance in red pill communities, and then ultimately realizing that he was not being served by these communities when shit hit the fan. So when he had struggles, when he experienced unemployment, when his relationship broke down, when he was navigating the uncertainty of COVID that so many of us all around the world were, he realized that the guidance in the communities that he thought he found through these red pill spaces actually did not, from his words, help to build and develop the solid foundation that he actually needed to withstand these challenges when they arose. I want to read a section of Will's story just to bring some of those experiences to life. It'll be very short, but he says in this report, in a world that seemed to demand change from men without offering a clear alternative, it felt like a lifeline. And by it, he means these red pill communities. I thought I had found the answers. I had no idea just how stuck and isolated I truly was, because I'd never felt what it's like to be out of isolation. My worldview hardened. Everything became binary, right or wrong, strong or weak, us versus them. Their words became gospel. I got the girlfriend, the business, the six-pack, and for a brief moment I believed I had made it. I believed I belonged, but I had built my house without foundations, from the outside in. And when the storm came, when my relationship ended, and when my business crumbled during COVID, I was completely flawed. I was back to feeling worthless. Only this time I was exhausted.
There's another quote actually from Will that I want to raise as well, because I think it really brings things full circle for this. There was nowhere else offering a clear roadmap to masculinity, nowhere else showing me how to navigate what it meant to be a man. And again, I think this just comes back to what we were talking about before, just having that understanding of what is drawing boys and young men to these influences is so important. They're not going to them because they're fundamentally bad people. They're going to them because they're feeling lost, they're feeling anxious, they're feeling concerned. They want to find answers and they're not getting it anywhere else. And just remembering that, I think, is just so important, because for me, I think the influencers are more of the symptom as opposed to the root cause. And I think what this report does really well is it starts to shine a light on what the actual root cause is and what we can do to start to tackle that.
I love those reflections. The symptom, not the root cause. And as you were speaking just then, I was thinking about the importance of also calling out the online systems that many young men under 18 are exposed to and navigating. And I think we also need to consider and be really mindful of the multi-billion-dollar organizations that young men are up against here, where yes, in some ways they may be searching and seeking out some of this content, some of these influences. But if we think about other platforms that you don't necessarily need to follow influencers, that you just log on and you are fed content curated to you as a user based on your user profile characteristics, how much onus can we really put on young men themselves to be responsible for the types of content that they're consuming, when we know that these algorithms are powered in a way that the most divisive, the most controversial, the most inflammatory influences and content are going to be pushed to young people? And that's not just in the videos, also it's in the comment section. So the comment under all of these videos, the ones that appear at the top are often the ones that are the most inflammatory, that have the most likes or dislikes, re-comments to those initial comments. But also it can raise comments to the top of that feed that the algorithm again determines the user are most likely to agree or align with. So I think that the algorithms and the systems are also so important to consider and to be mindful of when we're talking about these digital ecosystems.
The report highlighted that 13% of young men in this study did not have any close friends. That for me was one of the most striking statistics from the whole report. What kind of impact is that having on these boys and young men that you spoke to? And do you think that this is a cause or effect of them spending more time online?
Loneliness in young men and social disconnection in young men is not just an online issue, that actually we have had data over the last 2 decades come out that speaks to similar rates of loneliness in young men. And we're seeing those levels of loneliness increase, actually. So a lot of researchers and a lot of people have pointed to social media as, if not the reason, at least a risk factor for this social disconnection. But it's also really important for us to consider that social media allows for connection. Think about COVID. The reasons we were able to stay as connected as we were to people in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities were because of social media. And young people especially are so used to that being a mode of connection. And I think actually older generations sometimes are quick to kind of roll their eyes or dismiss the validity of that social connection. And I don't think that that's fair or just for young men who might game regularly, for example. Some of the gaming communities or the people that they may play games with can be their closest social connections, their closest friends. And again, by cutting off that avenue for connection, it's cutting off a lifeline for a number of them. But it is really sad. Like the 13%, as you said, of young men saying that they have no close friends. To me, even saying it now, reading it every time, it really does cut deep because I think about me and my life. Like my friends are so important to me, and growing up, they were such a foundational part of shaping my own identity as well, and such a key pillar in my well-being and quality of life and everything. So yes, it's not just an online issue. It's absolutely something that is taking place offline as well. But I think we need to be mindful to not just jump the gun and to point the finger at social media, that actually we can think about things from a strength-based way of how can we actually use social media to be able to encourage healthier forms of connection for young men who may be completely isolated offline.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to weaponize social media, and there are clearly a lot of flaws with it, but equally it is, as you were saying there, benefiting boys and young men too in the right ways. And so I think it's important, as you were saying there, not to just completely demonize it and not recognize maybe some of the benefits that it's having for boys and young men and their friendships as well. I want to shift gears to relationships and dating, because I think, again, this is a huge topic that we could probably spend an entire episode
Mm.
going through. But we'll just go through some of the key findings from the report. 49% of men in the study believe that women don't care about men, yet 30% who listened to influencers were in committed relationships, compared to 26% of non-engaged young men, which again was like another oxymoron for me. I just couldn't quite get my head around that. What's happening there exactly?
Mm. Yeah, the whole report really was a unpacking of contradictions, wasn't it? And that is one very interesting takeaway from my own perspective, but yeah, from Movember's perspective, is that I think it leads us to consider the disconnection potentially between young men's ideological beliefs that are maybe fueled and fed by the online influences that they're engaging with, and their realities and their beliefs that are based in those real offline interactions. Because if we just go by that data, with over a fifth of young men who were engaging with these masculinity influences, so more likely to be holding negative attitudes about women, also in committed relationships, and even more, like about 22 or 23% saying that they were, if not in committed relationships, looking for committed relationships, does absolutely unpack that friction there. And I think that says a lot about young men's desire for intimacy and for connection, and probably sheds light on the polarization that we're seeing as well play out, where I think if you asked young women about their desire for intimacy, their desire for connection, we may see similar rates of young women saying that they are looking for committed relationships. And it's easy sometimes to forget that that is the key pillar that allows for authentic connection. But then when you see some of these very regressive or restrictive attitudes that young men are holding, you start to question how can both of those realities exist? And we need to absolutely do more work to unpack why that might be, and how there could potentially be two conflicting components of men's beliefs here: the ideologies that are fueled by the online narratives that they're exposed to, and those offline desires and those offline realities. And it is really troubling and disconcerting in a number of ways. And I definitely want to stress that it is not women's job or women's roles to be unpacking and potentially in some instances, maybe de-radicalizing some young men. But I do think that if there are positive experiences that they're having in their offline lives, and when some of those relationships that they might be having with women in their offline lives are really strong, that dissonance that young men may be experiencing is a real opportunity for us to think about ways that we can empower them to use that dissonance to start to question some of the things that they may be hearing online, to think about how true that actually is of the women in their own lives, the women that they may be connecting with and having relationships with. So yeah, it certainly is a tricky problem, but also something that I think we can learn a lot from when we think about opportunities for early intervention and prevention to start to shift the tide on some of these really harmful and potentially misogynistic attitudes.
And then going specifically to dating, 86% of young men engaging with influencers reported feeling frustrated with dating, with online dating being especially problematic. What were some of their frustrations around dating and online dating? And Is the problem being then perpetuated by influencers telling boys that they're superior and women are essentially the problem to all of these issues that they're facing?
Yeah, online dating frustrations. That was really interesting. And again, I would say not unique to just young men. I think anyone, young women, people from diverse gender backgrounds would also experience online dating frustrations. But the source of those dating frustrations are what's different. And the source of those dating frustrations for young men are often so closely tied to their masculinity and to their assumptions about what young women are looking for in young men. So, with the age range of our sample being 16 to 25, some of these young men may not have even had long-term relationships before or have families of their own, yet they have these very clear ideas about the roles that them as men should be adopting. And those predefined roles can fuel that resentment around, well, women are only interested in high value men. So that's men who have money, who have status. There were these beliefs that women expect men to pay for everything on dates, and that women and men's values weren't aligned around dating. So they were some of the frustrations that young men were reporting. And how true that actually is of the young women that they may have interacted with, that they may in the future interact with, is hard to say. Like, we weren't able to capture that with the research that we did. But again, when we come back to the same source or the seed of connection, that actually people just want intimacy, they want connection, we can start to dismantle some of those beliefs and start to question how based in reality are they actually, or how much is social media just feeding and exacerbating some of those beliefs around the stereotypes that men and women are looking for in any potential partners.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As someone that's never used dating apps before, I'm only going purely from other conversations that I've had and other research that I've looked into. My view is that I don't think that women are just looking for high status men in reality, but I do think that online dating apps are perpetuating the issue. I mean, I
Mm.
learned recently that on certain apps you've got a height filter, which just blew my mind. So you can just put, let's say, men over 6 foot, for example, which
Mhm.
is just such a small percentage of the population. I think in the UK it was something like it was less than 20% of men are over 6 foot. So
Mhm.
immediately you're kind of like wiping out 80%. And then if you're putting anything else on top of that, then obviously that pool is just shrinking and shrinking. And Scott Galloway actually put it really well. He said that online dating apps are stopping men from demonstrating excellence in the real world. And he meant by that was things like demonstrating humor, for example, demonstrating
Mhm.
kindness. These are the things that you can't demonstrate online, unfortunately. And I think that this is where some of those red pill beliefs start to feed in, is because it's like, well, women are only looking for men over 6 foot.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, well, there is a filter for that, yeah, sure. But in reality, if men and women were meeting more in real life and men were able to demonstrate excellence, I think that would then eradicate a lot of these things. But I think this is where maybe some of those issues around online dating in particular are probably coming in.
Absolutely. It is certainly worthy of its own episode. But just to agree with everything that you said, I think that is so true. And again, bringing up the dating app system is really important here. Those filters that can be harmful for young men, but also for young women. Like, if you can
Mm.
select the ethnicity that you're interested in, what that does is it essentially gamifies something that is about human connection and authentic connection. So there is a whole other conversation to be had around how beneficial dating apps actually are and how that shuts down and limits our ability to connect offline. Yeah, so just to say that I think that there are things that aren't necessarily just gendered and frustrations that aren't necessarily just experienced by young men or by young women, but that it is really difficult, and to dismiss or undercut some of the frustrations that young men are facing. And when those desires for intimacy, for connection aren't realized, when they feel like they're doing everything right, yet continually ghosted or continually shut down for dates, for opportunities, for relationships, you can absolutely understand why so many of them then turn online to vent or find a lot of comfort in other stories that young men similar to them have also experienced. And again, when there aren't other opportunities to have those feelings, those concerns, those worries about being alone forever validated and legitimized, then of course there's going to be a vacuum that is just ripe to be filled by bad actors and bad influences in this space.
I absolutely loved the conclusion of the report, which said healthier men, healthier world. I thought that was just absolutely on the money, because one of the big challenges that we face with this conversation is the notion that it's a zero-sum game. So for women to succeed, men need to fail, and vice versa. And I think we absolutely need to start to eradicate that from our thinking, because it's just fundamentally blocking us from having these healthy conversations. If men are doing well, it's good for men and it's good for women, and vice versa. We need to be, I think, in my opinion, striving for a world where we're all winning and succeeding. And there's a really simple example in my life. I've got a 4-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. There's no part of me that wants one of them to succeed and the other one to fail. I want them both to do well. I want them both to thrive. And I've got a wife as well, and it's the same thing. I want her to thrive and I want her to succeed, and I want myself to thrive and myself to succeed. And I really think that we need to start to be striving for this, because I think that there's still this gag reflex sometimes when we talk about the issues and the trouble that boys and young men are having, and it almost needs to be diluted. Like, I've had so many conversations with people where I'm bringing up these kind of conversations, and it's almost like a reflex to say, oh yes, but on the other side, women and girls are struggling as well. Absolutely, there are issues going on, no question about it. But I think we need spaces where we're really, without diluting the conversation, talking about the problems that boys and young men are having, same with the issues that girls and women are having, and then also bringing each other into the conversation so that men can understand the issues and the challenges that women are having, and vice versa. Women can start to understand the challenges that boys and men are having, rather than feeling like we're having to dilute the conversation. Because if we're having a conversation around the challenges that girls and young women are having, I don't think there's any part of us that would feel compelled to say, yes, but look at the challenges that boys and young men are having, which I don't think is right. I think we should be looking at it from both sides. And if men are succeeding, women are succeeding, and vice versa, and that's really what we should be striving for.
What a beautiful place to end the interview on. All it is, not all it is, it isn't simple. It's a very big task that is ahead of all of us, but we need to be moving from a but to an and. Young women are struggling and young men are struggling.
I love that.
That's where we need to be moving to. And in the context of young women, there are absolutely harms and issues in the context of social media that are unique to them, that are worthy of research, of intervention, of solutions, of conversation. But that doesn't take away from all the work that still needs to be done with young men. And social media does play into that polarization, that separation of, but if we focus on young men, we take away or we dismiss the issues of young women. It comes back to the question that you asked me at the very start around what my reflections were when I finally finished this research, when I stepped away, and the clear differences between the online personality or persona that I have in my personal life and my personal profiles versus the type of content and the type of topics that I'm fed in my work profile and my work persona. And we need to be doing better to bring those two worlds together, that we can't have these siloed online lives, these online cultures that absolutely do feed into the narrative of, if you are not talking about my issues, then you don't care. And that isn't the case, that we need to be bringing diverse perspectives, diverse opinions, diversity in content into each other's feeds. I think swapping profiles should be a solution that we look at or that we think about, because it's shaping, because that not only shapes young people's developing identities, but also their ideological beliefs, their political beliefs. Like this has ramifications for so many things just beyond the immediate rupture in content or topic interests, that this is absolutely going to feed into everything, and that we can't continue to have this dislocation in our conversations around young women, young men, young people. Yeah, absolutely. Healthier men means healthier communities.
What are you in Movember planning next in the space of young men's health? Because like you were saying, it feels like we're just scratching the surface with this, and a lot of the areas that we were researching feels like it needs more research on top of that to clarify some of the points. What's next in the journey?
We sometimes joke at Movember here that us researchers will always say, well, we need more research once we have a completed piece of research. But that's absolutely the case. We know from this work that we need to call for more research in this area, that the field of social media and young men's mental health, but also young people's mental health, is still in its infancy. This phenomenon of social media hasn't been around for long enough for us to really understand and really quantify the health impacts here. So we're doing a lot of work at Movember, and I'm leading other projects that is looking at doing just that. It's looking at quantifying the health impacts over a longer period of time of exposure to masculinity orientated content. We will continue to advocate for the importance of research that brings young men's experiences and perspectives into everything that we do, that we cannot be having a conversation about young men without young men. So it's about co-designing research, co-designing solutions, and co-designing policy with the very people that it impacts. And lastly, we're also doing a lot of work at Movember to start to test and develop interventions on social media, showing up where young men are. We know that they're engaging and really interested in topics related to masculinity, related to mental health, related to self-optimization. And we can use and see that as a real opportunity for us as an organization, for a field, as health professionals, to show up in this space, to be able to provide the things that they're looking for, to be able to provide role models and narratives around masculinity that can help them, inspire them, motivate them to be the very best man that they can be, and to have very tangible roadmaps that they can follow, because we know that that's what they're looking for. We know that that's what they're engaging with. So it's no easy task. There are a number of things that I've touched on, but just to reiterate that it's a multi-pronged approach that we know is needed here, that Movember are absolutely willing and working hard to do, but we'll also be looking to continue to collaborate with other partners in this space. There are some incredible researchers doing some great work, some other incredible organizations looking to develop the very solutions that I've just touched on. So it's also about bringing the sector together.
Just to finish our conversation today, I want to imagine another Will who might be listening to this discussion. 22-year-old who is feeling disillusioned, who is feeling anxious, concerned, confused, looking for answers. What one message of hope would you want to directly share with that young man who's listening?
The message would be that it's normal to feel that way, that you don't have to have it all figured out despite what people might tell you, and that there is connections and community available to you where you can be yourself, where you can lean into that uncertainty, lean into that fragility, and come out better for it in the end with really deep, really rich connections, and with an ability to sit in that uncertainty and know that it's going to be okay, even if you don't have it figured out just yet, that is totally normal.
Dr. Krista, thank you so much again for your time today. I think the work that you're doing and Movember are doing is just so incredibly important. As we were saying at the start of the show, I think shows like Adolescence are great in terms of bringing the conversation to the mainstream, but we really do need to be falling back on this concrete research-based work that the likes of you and Movember are doing. I think it's so important. I also think it's incredibly inspiring to actually be speaking to a woman about this as well, and speaking to a woman who is so incredibly passionate and committed to this as well, because just comes back to, again, that zero-sum game mentality that we just need to move away from. And I think that voices like yours are just so important because they help to break down those walls and to show that this is a conversation for everyone. It's not just a conversation for men talking to other men. It is a conversation for us all. I think some of those takeaways that we've had today have been very, very powerful. And as you said, we're at the infancy of really understanding this, but it is that understanding that is so important. It is, as we were saying before, it's understanding the root causes and not just focusing on the symptoms because they're in front of us and they're loud and they're obvious and they're getting all the headlines. It's really understanding, well, what is driving boys and young men to these influences and what can we be doing earlier on to help tackle that. So I think with all of that said, it's been a brilliant conversation. I'm sure the report will do exceedingly well. We will definitely include it in the show notes. I'll also be promoting it as well to make sure that everyone can get a copy. But again, Dr. Krista, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Simeon, and for the opportunity to be able to have this really important conversation. I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head that understanding and exploring young men's experiences does not validate some of the harmful behaviors that we might be seeing at those extreme or radicalized ends. So I hope that the audience has also taken that away from our conversation today and the interview today. And also just to shout out the importance of podcasts as well, because we know so many young men are turning to podcasts. So, you know, yourself included, are doing a really great job at being able to show up in those spaces that young men are turning to. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.